Welcome back to the Queer Circle, where queer healers step up to the mic to share their journeys and what they tell their younger self. Today we have Jeanna Eichenbaum. Jeanna is a queer, trans, Jewish dyke woman in San Francisco. She has a private psychotherapy practice working with adolescents, couples, and various non-monogamous configurations. Currently, she is working remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Jeanna specializes in working with and providing support to queer, trans, and gender variant people. She also practices ketamine-assisted psychotherapy at Healing Realm Center. Welcome to the Queer Circle, Jeanna.
I came into the world via Tom and Shirley Eichenbaum, who were married for about a year. Actually, they were married probably a few months before I started to knock on somebody's door. And my parents were married for about 59 and a half years. My mom passed about 5 years ago. I think the kind of extraordinary, compelling part of my story historically is that my father is a Holocaust survivor and lost his entire family, his mother, father, older brother, and older sister in the concentration camps in World War II in Europe. And my dad also was in a couple concentration camps. He was only 13 when the war ended, so he was a young survivor. He survived one of the Jewish children's death marches. And so he was quite a hard, rough person for me growing up. My mom was much warmer and more relational. My dad was really scary and prone to rages that seemed to come out of nowhere. I think it was years before most people had a notion of post-traumatic stress disorder. He could be, he had his moments of being loving and sweet. We used to wrestle together. And that was a really nice way for me as a kid to connect with him. But mostly he was just a bundle of, as I look back now, a kind of bundle of unhealed trauma that lashed out at everyone around him, from his wife to his kids to the neighbors. I used to watch my dad get into fistfights with people. He was really out of control. And, we both suffered with it and also were, I think, incredibly aware of his endurance and aware of the idea that maybe some of that was being transmitted somehow to us. There's a movie that I saw many years ago. I don't remember the name of the director, M. Night Shyamalan or something like that. It was the director of The Sixth Sense. This movie is called Unbreakable, and it's about a person who survives a train crash outside of Philadelphia, which is where I grew up. And anyway, then this person who's very fragile and getting sick all the time befriends him to try to find out how, of all the people in the train crash, he's the one that survived. And it turns out that he's unbreakable. And I watched that movie like 3 or 4 times in a row, and it wasn't until years later that I realized that I was so drawn to that film because it's about my dad, who is unbreakable. He's survived and outlasted a cancer diagnosis and prognosis. And recently, a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, christened him the world's toughest Jew, which provoked a big laugh on both of our parts. Um, yeah, so, and I just have a lot of fond memories of my mom from childhood as just being like a pal. Um, but I think the overarching kind of historical theme of my childhood and early youth was even being different from other American Jewish kids because of this legacy, this European legacy. I think one of my earliest realizations of self in relating, as it relates to gender, is I think I was maybe 5 years old, and I was in a summer camp, um, and the troop that I was in, of other little kids, all boys, um, were putting on a play, and the camp counselors were divvying up the parts, and all of a sudden they came to this awareness that or idea that I would play the woman in the play. And all the kids started laughing, and the camp counselors were laughing. They thought it was really funny. And I remember both feeling mortified and upset that I had to be the girl, and also wondering what it was about me that was making me, of all the little boys, I did identify as a boy in my youth, out of all the little boys, what was it about me that they were somehow seeing? Were they seeing something that prompted them to make that choice? And then I remember also when I was 8 years old, my parents were out one night, and we had a babysitter, and the phone rang, and I answered the phone, and the person on the other end of the line thought that I was a girl. And I remember at that moment also getting upset, like upset, and wondering how come she thinks that. So, I think there was just some sense maybe that people were seeing something that I wasn't seeing or manifesting inside of myself yet. It was confusing for me. I remember as a young kid being very, very drawn, almost like in this mystical way, to watching wrestling and boxing on television. I was completely enthralled with the old grainy, like Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, or, the 1950s and 60s. Bruno Sammartino was the wrestling champion of the world. And I would just spend hours watching this stuff. So the idea that somebody was pegging me as female was, I don't know, maybe concerning. I felt like I was a relatively kind of quote unquote normal kid growing up. I noticed that I seemed to be more sensitive than the other boys around me. And that sensitivity and maybe a certain kind of tentativeness really got noticed when elementary school moved into what at the time was called junior high school. I think now it's called middle school. And I became subject very quickly to kind of ferocious bullying, targeting me as what I think people saw as a young queer. I was called faggot all the time. I was chased home from school. I was small for my age and hadn't developed. I was a slow developer, so I was always afraid to get into fights. and which did not help me. If I'd fought back once or twice, I think things could have been different, but I wouldn't. I was just really afraid of it. So I experienced a lot of bullying. I didn't quite understand why I was being targeted in the way that I was, because as my sexuality was starting to blossom, I was incredibly attracted and drawn to other girls. And so I didn't fit the model of like the classic gay boy or faggot, and it was just all a confusing blur to me. I think I took on a lot of shame at that point, feeling like there was something deeply wrong with me, wishing I could fit in and didn't. So I think my early awarenesses of queerness, of the beginnings of possible transness, were not happy. They were kind of like really painful, ununderstood rites of passage, maybe is one way of thinking about it. There were several mentors slash heroes of mine that I can think of. It's interesting. When I was a kid, there was this TV personality in Philadelphia by the name of Gene London, who had a children's show. He actually just died last year, and I just loved that guy's show. And my cousins and we would always talk about Gene London and how amazing it was. And one day my grandmother decided to take us all. You could be like a part of the show as it was filming. And so, I think it was a Sunday morning. We went to the CBS television studios, which was its whole thing. And we were sitting in the audience, and at the beginning of the show, Gene London, whose real name was Eugene Yulish, would pick like 5 or 6 kids from the audience to come down and be on the show, be part of that day's show the whole time. And I got picked, and I was like, it was one of those moments where I think I felt like, oh, destiny has kind of sprinkled something over me that I'm getting to be part of this. And I didn't find out until years later that Gene London was gay, super queer guy. And, once again, only this time in a positive way, somebody picking me out and saying, come. So some of my heroes and mentors, when I was a kid, my grandfather, who was a very lovely man, also with a lot of Holocaust trauma, he was a merchant, and he had a store, a big outlet in the industrial section of downtown Philadelphia. I used to go there often with my parents. And there'd be these huge boxes where the clothes would come in, and as the clothes were emptied out onto the shelves, the boxes would be empty. And my grandfather had this employee, this black man by the name of Robert, who worked with him for many years. And Robert was like in his probably mid-20s at that point, and he and I just immediately gravitated to one another. He just looked out for me when I was in the store. He played with me. He would come play hide and seek with me in the boxes. I felt incredibly safe with him, and he was probably my first outside the family positive expression of masculinity that I had experienced. I actually hadn't experienced an expression of positive masculinity in my family. And this guy who, like, could have been any number of things, but, just treated me with care and respect and a lot of love. And I just kind of like worshipped. He was kind of like the first person that I worshipped, almost like a rock star or something. Um, so there was him, and then in my teens, um, I came across Bob Dylan and Lou Reed, and just iconic singer songwriters. And I think both of them, in very, very different ways, they were both Jewish. Um, Both of them exhibited a level of linguistic dexterity and coolness that I didn't know was possible. I didn't know that there was a way to articulate human experience at the level of rage and heartbreak and yearning and spiritual questing, until I ran across those people. The other person I feel like I should mention is Kate Bornstein. So when I in the years when I was struggling to come out, as myself as a woman, Kate used to do one-person shows at the old Josie's Juice Joint, at Market and 16th, right on the corner. Um, and I went to see a couple of her shows. And after one of them, I dressed in drag, what I considered at the time to be drag, one night and went to the show with a friend of mine. And at the end of the show, I was standing in the audience, and Kate, who was this famous trans performer, like the first public transsexual I'd ever seen. She was standing kind of up at the front, and I'm in the audience, and our eyes met, and she just put her hand out and went, kind of like waved to me to come in. And she got right away that I wasn't in drag. I was just starting to be myself. And it was this just incredibly powerful moment. Years later, in the midst of my suffering and closetedness about being trans, I don't know where this came from, but I was working at St. Francis Hospital up in Nob Hill. I was a medical social worker for years. And I was really struggling. It was a very dark time. And all of a sudden, I just had this idea: I have to call Kate Bornstein and ask her what I should do. And I went across the street to a payphone. This is before cell phones were ever a thing. I walked across the street to the payphone. I looked up Kate's number in the phone book. There were such things as phone books. And I called her. And she talked to me for like an hour on the phone. And I remember her just saying, "It's going to be okay. Wherever I've gone with this, you're going to go farther." And, the fact that she would take that time to talk to somebody that I'm sure she didn't remember, was just like a saving grace. Well, I think the darker, harder times lasted a long time. And I guess, like with any dark, hard times that people go through, you don't know at the time that it's going to turn out okay, or that it's not going to be dark and hard any for any time going forward. But mine lasted a long time, and I think my realization, I had this realization in my early 20s that came into me kind of like a thunderbolt, that I was really a woman, that all my struggles around sexuality and am I more attracted to men? Am I more attracted to women? Where am I located on that spectrum? Like all of a sudden, I had this awareness that, and it was the awareness that I somehow was my mom, that I wasn't my dad, that my mom was existing in me in this almost like needing to come out, needing to be out, and that awareness was not really welcomed. I wanted more than anything just to be a normal, boring, middle class person and have a spouse and a family. And so when I had that awareness or epiphany around my gender, I then basically spent the next maybe quarter century doing everything I could to repress it and fight it, and grew a beard and worked out and, became kind of rough in my manners, and just went in a almost like hyper masculine direction. And but it was all exterior. It was all on the outside. None of it was embodied. I couldn't keep it up when I was in the actual presence of people. The only time I felt at peace was when I would be in the woods, surrounded by trees, because there it doesn't matter what your gender is. You're just another creature. And so anyway, I was keeping up this pretense, and my life really at that point was dark and sad. I don't think I had many friends at all because I felt like my gender was so shameful. The idea that I would want to be a woman was so shameful to me that I didn't want to have anybody know about it. So I didn't date. I had no real romantic or, meaningful contact with people. It's a time when I fell into, anonymous and paid for sexual encounters, lap dance clubs, things like that. And that just lasted for years. That was the only source of physical connection for me, which is really sad and narrow as I look back on it. And even as I was fighting this, it was somehow solidifying inside of me. I would have these experiences where I remember once before I got back into therapy, the reason I got back into therapy is I started having this image in my mind that I was being chiseled into a female form. And I couldn't stop the image from coming into my mind. And so, I got back into some kind of therapy. I saw a number of therapists, some of them good for me, some of them not so good. And one of the things that really helped and impacted me was when a therapist one day said to me, the thing that you think is most shameful about you might just be your best quality. And it just kind of took everything and stood it on its head. The other thing that happened in that very dark time was I encountered somebody who was kind of like an modern urban shaman type person by the name of Vince Valentine. That wasn't his real name, but that was his name. And he and I had very open discussions about things, and he started to feel like I should take a large dose of LSD to try to get some healing. And paradoxically, he thought the healing would be that I would become I would work through whatever my stuff is about being a guy and become more comfortable with that. Um, and after about a year under his tutelage, learning how to meditate and taking day long hikes um, and eating well, I took a very large dose of LSD for the first time in my life, 400 micrograms, which is an extremely large dose, a powerful dose, and proceeded to have the most amazing experience of my life. Um, I saw all kinds of wondrous things. Um, I passed my grandfather in the sky as we were floating in the atmosphere. And at one point during the journey, I met an entity that I can only describe as what I thought was God. And in a very mean, threatening, loud voice, was asking me, "What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?" over and over again. And before I knew it, I was saying every single thing I had ever done or thought that I needed to confess. Everything that I thought was some kind of sin or transgression in my actions or in my heart. And it all came out like rapid fire. I'd never talked so quickly, so fast in my life, but it was like endless. It was a torrent of things. And at the end of it, which seemed to go on forever, but in LSD time, who knows what time is? It could have been 3 hours or 3 nanoseconds. At the end of it, the voice was much quieter now and said, "Okay, and is there anything else?" Because I'd held one thing back. And I said, "Yes, I want to be a woman." And there was this long pause, and I could hear the wind rustling in the desert, like through the cacti. And then the voice said in a real playful, teasing way, "What's wrong with that?" And I had this moment of complete opening where I felt just unconditional love come into me in every direction. I experienced that there was nothing wrong with me, that there's nothing wrong with what I wanted. There was nothing wrong with the realization that I had about myself, that it was all just fine and correct. And that the only thing that was wrong was that I thought there was something wrong with me. And that gender is something to play with. It's okay. It's okay to play everything. It's okay to play with almost everything. The very last thing that deity or entity said to me as it was leaving was, "Oh, one more thing. Don't forget to laugh." And that was the end of my journey. That was the end of my LSD experience. It was many years after that before I actually transitioned. I continued to struggle mightily with self-doubt and shame, but something had been planted in me that maybe this is okay. And it took a long time for it to coalesce, but that was a pivotal part of my experience. One of the main pitfalls or setbacks is at that time, which is like 30 some years ago, psychedelics are going through a whole mental health renaissance right now. And there's an awareness of the importance of preparation and integration of the experiences that people have. And I didn't have any integration experiences, so I had this extremely large experience of knowing I'm fine and knowing that being trans is great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's amazing. It's just another version of human experience. Or call it whatever you want. Like sometimes I think of myself as trans, sometimes I just think of myself as a woman. Um, but there wasn't any integration, so I quickly went back to my old mind. Um, in Zen, there's this concept of beginner mind. Beginner mind is always looking at things fresh and new, and I went back to my old mind. I had this large experience, but there was no way of making sense of it, so part of me, I think, just disbelieved it or said, well, it's just a powerful drug. And then I was back in it, right? Maybe one way of thinking about it is the whale regurgitated me and then unconsciously sucked me back in during the next inhale. I'm back in it, and at some point in this process, I came out to my parents one night as trans, which was a very hard conversation for me to have. I thought that my dad would disown me. As I said earlier, he was a very tough, rough guy. I thought he would disown me, and part of what made it so difficult is I was the only son of 3 kids. And because he'd lost so many people in the Holocaust, I think I felt like it was my duty to propagate the family name. And back then, I didn't know of any trans people that were having kids or banking sperm or anything like that. That also just wasn't even a thing at that time that I was aware of. Anyway, so I came out to them, and his reaction in particular was surprising and somehow surprisingly disturbing to me, because he didn't understand it. He obviously didn't like it, but he accepted it. And I wasn't prepared for him to accept it. And I was starting graduate school, so I came back to the Bay Area to start school. And this barrier that I had expected to be there that would stop me from going forward, namely my dad's refusal to accept it, wasn't there. And I was thrown into a dark depression that lasted for years. For about the next 3 years, I was really suicidal. On a daily basis, I grappled with whether or not to stay here or take my life and leave. And very hard times, very painful times. All the kind of empty sex increased, that whole thing increased. I don't know, I think at a certain point, I guess I just felt like I'm either, like I'm doing things to live, I'm getting my graduate degree, connecting with people, I am starting to date a little bit, and then I'm really struggling with this thing over here of coming out, and can I even do this, and what would my life be like if I did? But it was mixed with other things. I remember one night I went with a person that I was dating at the time to the stud. And so we're out on the dance floor. And I realized in that moment that there were 5 or 6 people on the dance floor. Um, Half of them women, half of them identified as men that I had been in sexual relationships with in the past couple years. And I remember thinking, this is an amazing life, right? I am a being without boundaries in the best possible way. Um, and it felt so amazing to have this like representation of myself right there in this wild San Francisco nightlife club, queer club. So there was also that going on as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, there was a lot of depression, there was a lot of pain, but there was also some part of me that was always trying to make something else happen, even if I couldn't or didn't know how to do it. Um, and in the in some at some point in there, I found a group of people that was working on sexual healing and trying to let go of problematic behaviors or harmful either to self or oftentimes others behaviors around sex and sex and relationships and so I got involved with all that, and that became a very powerful part of my healing as well, and also required walking through like meeting my shadow self and confronting things and taking responsibility and trying to atone for things. So it was all there. It was all part of there was just like a long dark period of trying to make something new happen and being defeated by my fear and my maybe even my lack of imagination at what could come next. I think in the dark place, one of the writers that really spoke to me when I was in college and grad school was Hermann Hesse, who wrote Siddhartha and Magister Ludi, Narcissus and Goldman. And I remember when I read the novel Steppenwolf, that really seemed like me. It was this person with a lot of darkness and a lot of secrets, an inability to fully live, but also a lot of potential creativity inside them. And they experience themselves as the Steppenwolf, which is the German word for wolf of the steppes, the wolf in the mountains. Um, Too dark for the light of day, too dark for human consumption and community. And I experienced myself very much, and I identified a lot with that character at my low points. I also had this awareness, there's this notion that post-traumatic stress disorder is inherited or inheritable. Rachel Yehuda is a researcher at Yeshiva University in New York who's done a lot of research with children of Holocaust survivors and found that not just our psychological markers, but our biological markers of an over-stress response to things is present in the next 2 generations post the survivors of a severe trauma. And I did have an experience, kind of another shamanic journey where I experienced in a very deep way that my father's PTSD had come into me, not just psychologically, but during the moment of my insemination, that his trauma was in his blood cells, in his blood, in his bones, in his sinews. So how could it not then, in me receiving his life stuff and my mom's life stuff and creating my life stuff, that was now a part of me as well. And interestingly, the awareness of that wasn't overwhelming or negative. It was more like a moment of clarity. It just explained something that 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 experience is in me. It's a part of me. It's what forms my... It says something about my capacity to be a healer. Like, it's the kind of thing that's either going to destroy you or it's going to be transmuted into something that can be used to save yourself and help others. And that process of it being transmuted into something that can save yourself and help others, I think that's a mysterious process. I don't think I'd be able to answer with any particular clarity to this day why that happened to me as opposed to it going the other way. Other than to say that I think something about my dad's endurance as well as his trauma is in me. I'd be neglectful to not mention I also had a therapist who I saw for about 20 years and I started seeing her at the real down point of my suicidality, and she saved my life. I often will tell people she saved my life, and she did. And it was in that therapy that I learned how to love another human being, because I initially fell in love with her, and there was that whole transference to work through appropriately, and we did. But my heart opens with that particular clinician. And I used to have just like wild, what incredibly tame but wild experiences. I would go in for my therapy session with Kim, and I would lay down on the sofa, and I would fall asleep for 45 minutes. And we would spend 5 minutes talking, and then I would leave. And the fact that I could sleep in front of another human being, that I felt that level of safety, was part of the healing process for me. So she also was seminal in my moving out of something and into something. Oh, this therapy thing actually can work. It's scary and hard and messy, and the therapist makes mistakes, and the client makes mistakes, and it can work. Many things came to play a significant part in my coming back to life. Two things that come to mind were experiencing unconditional love from my grandfather and my baby sister. To my grandfather, I was always the miracle of Jewish renewal that the Nazis couldn't kill, and he just doted on me. And to my sister, I was smart and incredibly funny. Their love probably held me when nothing else did. At some point, I entered into a kind of recovery community for some of my unhealed sexual wounds, and I found a lot of love and support to assist me in creating a life closer to the ideals that I aspired to. A number of years ago, I also had several life-altering experiences in a shamanic context. And in one of them, I experienced that the Holocaust was in me, in my bones and sinew, in my tissues and organs. That suffering had been transmitted not simply psychologically, but literally during the insemination of my being. This realization was paradoxically not a painful one, but more just a moment of clarity and acceptance of some of the many forces that have shaped me. Like many children of Holocaust survivors, it informs my commitment to social justice, my determination to side with the oppressed, the need to understand, and the desire to help. In the beauty of that shamanic experience, I also had a deep experience that my beauty and life force are strong and pure, that my complex tapestry is wondrous and right. And I also wanted to mention that along the way there was a lot of sexual healing. One of the unintended consequences of a lifetime of avoiding real intimacy was the feeling that I didn't know how to do sex well, and this feeling created a lot of problems for me and my various partners over the years. I could never receive enough of the right kind of reassurance to know in my bones that I was an adequate sexual partner. As I explored sexuality and romantic partnership in the context of a supportive group of others, I very gradually came to experience myself as loving, fun, good in bed, joyful, curious, exploratory. My relational skills gradually increased as my ability to relate to myself with kindness did. As I said earlier, there's some mystery at the core of it where I don't understand myself how I came to the healing that I've experienced, because it could have gone, in looking back, it seems like it could have gone another darker way. And at some point it didn't. So I think one of the things that I offer in my work, just by virtue of my being, is a not knowing. That there's the person I'm working with or the community that I'm working with, and there's me, and then there's other deeper forces and mysteries that we're trying to conjure to bring out, that somebody's inner wisdom is somehow going to be the guide, and I don't know how long things are going to take, and I can offer my best ideas about things, but people offered me a lot of best ideas, and things stuck when they stuck. One of the things that I am aware of today is that there is self-love. There is the possibility of real, meaningful acceptance and joy in the self that we have. And that reaching this place requires a certain amount of hard work and dedication. Maybe devotion is a better word than dedication. Devotion to yourself, to the preciousness of your being, to finding yourself, finding something worth holding on to amidst all the things that might keep one down, whether they're structural society pieces involved with racism or anti-Semitism or other forms of hatred or misogyny or personal traumas and wounds. The devotion to life, maybe, in some deep way that also involves death, that also involves everything. And trusting, there's a saying in some of, I think, the 12-step rooms, or I worked for years at a recovery treatment community, and the saying is trust the process. Just to trust the process. We don't know what's going to happen, but let's see what can happen. Maybe something can happen. There's a really amazing passage from Rilke, the German poet, in, I think, Letters to a Young Poet, where he talks about everything that is difficult to understand about yourself now is difficult because you just don't have the language and the words, and that if you just live your way, you can't have a solution to it because the solution wouldn't make sense in your present tense. But if you just live, if you just continue to live, you can live your way into your own solution. And so I think what I would tell all the young Jeannas in the world, and all your amazing complexity, maybe you're misplaced, maybe you're mistimed, the first thing I think I'd want to say is don't give up. Just keep going, keep at it. You are the one who just doesn't see yet how amazing, how beautiful, how important you are. That there's crazy wisdom in the world. There's left-handed, reverse position, going down into the ground wisdom that will be there for you to draw on. There are things that don't make sense, that will never make sense, but help you know less. There's every likelihood that you're going to have amazing experiences throughout your life that you can't even see yet. You just have to hang around for them and keep digging, keep going, don't stop. There's always going to be another chapter, and that chapter could be the chapter that opens it all up. And there's going to be people like me who have been through my own journey that you're going to find to help you. Because that's what we want most to do.
Thank you for joining us today, Jeanna. And thank you, listener, for joining us in the Queer Circle. To learn more about Jeanna's work, visit her website, JeannaEichenbaumTherapy.com, or go to queercirclepodcast.com, where all of this information can be found. Music for today's show was provided by Purple Fluorite. Purple Fluorite's music can be found anywhere streaming is available, iTunes, Spotify, and beyond.